Hello everyone, this year I wanted to make a horror manga video for Halloween, so I decided to make a list of my top 10 horror manga. This is just going to be a list, it's not a countdown or in an order of any kind. I'm also not going to include manga by Junji Ito since his manga are talked about so much and often take up the majority of these types of lists on YouTube. And I'll also choose different series than the ones that I've already done horror manga reviews on my channel for, because I've already talked about those at length and I want to pick something different. Those are all great manga that are on level with the ones in this countdown. And if you want, you could take those manga that I've done the reviews on, like Fu no Tane, Koisho Radio, and You Will Hear the Voice of the Dead, and put those with some of Ito's best works like Uzumaki, Hellstar Remina, Black Paradox, No Longer Human, and put those with the 10 in this video for like a top 20. And that would probably be accurate for about my top 20 horror manga. So I'll get started, and first on the list is going to be Kurosagi Corpse Delivery by Eiji Otsuka. This manga is about a group of university students who meet and they come together and they start a business where they grant the last wishes of people who have died, usually by either bringing their corpse to a certain place or fulfilling some sort of last request that in many cases will bring to light the circumstances of their death and in many cases bring justice to the person who caused their death. In exchange for this, the dead person will leave them something of value or give them some sort of information that will lead them to something of value. First is the main character, Kuro Kuratsu, who is a Buddhist monk in training, who has an ability that allows him to hear the voices of the dead, which in turn allows him to hear their final requests. He also has a power that allows him to reanimate corpses, which in a lot of these stories will allow the corpse to take their final revenge on the person that killed them. Next, there's Makoto Numata, who is able to seek out corpses for them by using a dowsing technique. There's Keiko Makino, who has skills as an embalmer, and there's Yuji Yada, who's kind of a comic relief character. He holds a puppet on one of his hands that he claims an alien speaks through. This power rarely helps with the group's activities, and he's kind of an annoying comic relief character through the most part. But with time, he also becomes somewhat of an interesting character, where you start to doubt whether he is just kind of making it up or is crazy, or if an alien really is talking through his puppet. And this group is brought together by their leader, Aosagi Sasaki, who was the one that brought the group together and came up with the idea of making this into a business. The story plays out in a mostly episodic fashion where the group will take on different cases for different corpses they find. And over the course of the chapter, or the next few chapters, they will solve the case for them and bring the corpse where they want to go to fulfill their last request. Each of these cases are really entertaining, well thought out, with a ton of different scenarios and mysteries behind the corpse's death that end up being uncovered by the group. The stories are presented in a really entertaining way that has plenty of gruesome imagery with the large number of brutal murders and corpses seen throughout the series. But it also blends in some aspects of dark comedy that add some levity to the series and make it easier to read and more entertaining. The likable characters and the fact that each short story arc is well written and engaging make this a manga that I recommend for all manga fans, even if you aren't a fan of horror manga. So number 2 on my list, I have Emerging by Masaya Hokuzono. This manga began publication in 2004, and it centers around the emergence of a new Ebola-like contagion spreading around Japan. The contagion in this manga is similar to the Ebola virus in real life, but is much more deadly. Much of the horror in this manga comes from the devastating effects that the sickness has on the people that catch it. The sickness being a type of hemorrhagic fever that causes the breakdown of collagen in the body, leading to the breakdown of blood vessels, causing the people that get it to bleed immensely from all of their orifices, and basically near the end of their life they break down so far to the point where they basically explode, spraying blood everywhere and spreading the virus around, causing more people to get infected. The art in the manga is great, and it shows some really disgusting graphic scenes that are really gruesome and horrifying, but also have a level of realism to it. The sickness in the manga is fictional, but it still has a lot of similarities to real viruses like Ebola or the Marburg virus, and the only real difference is that this one has a faster incubation period and you see more severe effects come up more quickly. The main characters of the manga are two doctors that examine the first patient to be diagnosed with the sickness, and much of the story focuses on them trying to learn about the sickness and find ways to protect the public from it. And a lot of it centers around the government's response to the sickness emerging and the difficulties and poor responses that come from that. Something I appreciated about this manga was that it didn't really go over the top. It stays kind of realistic and somewhat within the realms of plausibility. This manga was written in 2004 and actually holds up pretty well to things that have happened in recent events, with some of the ways that the government struggles to deal with the sudden public health crisis and the people's reaction and sort of panic. This one's a good read and something I also recommend to people, whether you like horror manga or not, as this one does have some scenes that are as horrifying as anything I've seen in any horror manga, but is not really a story that is firmly in the horror genre. And third on the list, I'm going to go with one of Go Tanabe's adaptations of an H.P. Lovecraft story. He's done a whole series of them, and every one that I've read has been a really great adaptation with some really incredible artwork that managed to be a pretty faithful adaptation of the stories, but also managed to bring a visual aspect into it that's really well done. I've read most of these manga adaptations, and I think the best one, in my opinion, is probably In the Mountains of Madness, since it is probably the longest manga in the whole series, and it kind of develops the story and character a little bit better through the longer length of the story. Also, it's based off of good source material and possibly my favorite H.P. Lovecraft story. So I'll go with In the Mountains of Madness for the list, but I really recommend any of the Go Tanabe H.P. Lovecraft adaptations because everyone I've read has been very well done and they all have very similar artwork and style to them. So this manga is an adaptation of the H.P. Lovecraft story by the same title. It is about an exploratory expedition to Antarctica led by the main character, a Dr. William Dyer. During the expedition, they discover a large mountain range in the middle of Antarctica. The group sets off to explore the previously unexplored continent of Antarctica. A group of the scientists end up finding a number of ancient but very well preserved remains of some unknown creature, unlike anything that has ever existed on Earth. The main group of the expedition ends up losing contact with the group that were studying these beings, and when the main group gets to them, they discover that the camp has been destroyed and all the men in the camp have been killed, and a number of the remains of the strange beings have disappeared. Later, Dr. Dyer and one of his students fly in a plane to investigate the great mountain range that is further within Antarctica. Once they arrive there, they find the remnants of an ancient civilization that once existed on the Antarctic continent. As they explore the ruins, they find murals that tell the history of the civilization that they have discovered. They find that the creatures that were discovered by the expedition team were actually members of the race that built this huge civilization on Antarctica. As they progress deeper into the labyrinthian ruins, they discover more about the ancient history of Earth and humanity, as well as discovering unbelievable horrors that they never could have imagined still existing in the deep parts of the ruins. This is a great adaptation that's pretty faithful to the original story. Tanabe's artwork's great, and he really does a good job of bringing to life the Lovecraftian horrors and the bizarre creatures presented in the story. All of the manga in this series have artwork that gives it a pretty eerie, creepy feel, as well as having a great atmosphere to them. This is another manga that I really recommend and is great whether you're a fan of Lovecraft or if you're not even familiar with his works. It's a great place to get started. And next I have an older manga. This one is a classic by the artist who could really be considered the father of horror manga, Umezu Kazuo. As one of the most important mangaka in horror manga, he has made a number of works that are worthy of this list, but for this list I'm going to go with the one that is possibly my favorite, and that is Orochi. This manga began publication way back in 1969. This manga is a series of stories told by this manga's main character, a basically immortal woman by the name of Orochi, who in addition to her long lifespan possesses a number of other powers that are contained within her hands. These powers give her the ability to do a number of things such as read people's thoughts to a certain extent, or heal their wounds if she touches their wound. And in one story, she even accidentally brings a corpse back to life with her own blood. The premise of the story is Orochi travels around and observes humanity. She wanders around until she finds someone that she finds interesting, and then from that point she will observe their life, usually to gain some sort of insight into humanity or answer some kind of question she has about humanity, or sometimes she just thinks that the person or their situation is interesting and she wants to see how things turn out for them. Her long lifespan allows her to observe these people for basically their entire life. So in each individual story, you will get basically the main character of that story's entire life story told through the perspective of Orochi observing them. She usually will try to just observe them and not interfere with their situation, but in some cases something will happen that will cause her to choose to interfere with her powers, and in many cases this is not always for the best of the people involved. The manga is divided into 9 stories, each one focusing on a person that is being observed by Orochi. These stories cover a various number of topics, some of them more supernatural, some of them not as much outside of Orochi's powers. They are mostly tragic stories that deal with a number of human conditions. There's a number of the stories I thought were really well written. A couple of them weren't quite as good, but overall it's a really great manga from one of the all-time masters of horror manga. And I think horror manga fans should read more of Umezu Kazuo's work, because I'm sure almost every horror manga artist out there has either been influenced by his work or influenced by someone who was influenced by his work. And at number 5 on my list, I have Boku ga Shinu dake no Hyakumonogatari, written by Anji Matono. This is a somewhat more recent manga that is still currently publishing. It's a little more than halfway finished at this point, but I really enjoy what's been put out so far. The way that the manga is organized is that it's a collection of short horror stories that are being told to the reader by a young boy who is the narrator of the series that introduces the stories. The chapters open up with a first-person view into the boy's bedroom, and he speaks to the reader and introduces that day's story to the reader, and then the story begins. And then at the end of the story, he gives a short conclusion that concludes the chapter. Through these short interactions with the reader, you can see a little bit into the boy's life. At first, in the early chapters, everything around him seems pretty normal, and you don't really get much insight into his life. As the chapters go on, you see that the boy has somewhat of an abusive home life, where his parents yell at him a lot and treat him pretty badly. And then into the later chapters, you see things become increasingly paranormal within his home. So far, it hasn't really been revealed what's going on with him exactly, but it's starting to be revealed with more of the recent chapters. So the sections with the boy telling the stories serve as the bookends of the series that introduce and close the stories and ties the series together with a plot that continues throughout the manga. Other than that, the stories are presented in an anthology format where each story is completely unrelated to each other. By the time the manga finishes, there will be 100 stories told in the manga, since the manga is referencing to the folklore of the 100 stories, which is a sort of folktale where people will get together at night and tell 100 ghost stories, and after each story they would extinguish a candle, and by the time 100 stories are finished and the final candle is extinguished, supposedly something supernatural can happen and spirits can be summoned. The stories themselves are some of the best that I've seen in any of these horror anthology manga. There's a wide variety of stories with a whole bunch of different types of horror being explored in each one. To me, some of the stories were a bit hit and miss, but there were far more ones that I enjoyed than ones that I didn't. There's a pretty wide variety of the types of stories that are told, so I think there's some type of horror that everyone will enjoy in these stories. The stories are pretty short, but long enough to tell a pretty memorable story in some of them. And there's some pretty good artwork in some of the stories with some pretty creepy things showing up. And I really like these horror anthologies because of the variety that you get, and this one, like I said, is one of the best that I've read of these horror anthologies, so I definitely recommend this one. And number 6 on my list, I'm going to go with World Apartment Horror by Satoshi Kon. So this one is a little bit lesser known manga by one of the greatest anime directors of all time, Satoshi Kon, famous for directing things like Perfect Blue or Paprika or Tokyo Godfathers and a number of other films. He's a great director and very well known as that, but I think he's also a very underrated manga artist. The World Apartment Horror manga is a single volume manga that consists of the short World Apartment Horror story as well as 3 other short horror manga stories. The longest story, World Apartment Horror, is actually an adaptation of a live-action film directed by Katsuhiro Otomo, who is famous for directing Akira. The movie was directed by Katsuhiro Otomo, and the story for the movie was written by Satoshi Kon. The main character is a low-ranked Yakuza member who's sent by his superiors to clear out an apartment building that his bosses want to make use of. The building is being lived in by a number of immigrants to Japan that are in the country illegally. The man's forced by his bosses to try to clear these people out of the building. His bosses give him 1 week to clear out the building, but he has a lot of trouble trying to get the people to leave. He tries a number of desperate tactics to get people out of the building, but ends up failing at every turn. Then things get even worse for him when an evil spirit makes its presence known in the building, and throughout its time there, the spirit's activity gets more and more severe. This one's a pretty fun, enjoyable story. It blends a lot of comedy with its horror. It doesn't really take itself too seriously, even though there is a haunting and evil spirit. Things never really get too serious and the stakes don't really feel too high. It's more fast-paced, fun manga. But as with any work by Satoshi Kon, the visuals are amazing and make the manga worth reading alone just for that. But the story is pretty enjoyable with pretty likable characters as well. The other 3 short stories are pretty enjoyable as well. The best one is probably the second story called Visitors. This story is about a family who move into a new house, and soon after moving in, they start to experience paranormal phenomenon. As time goes by of them living there, the paranormal activity increases and they start seeing more and more ghosts. The son of the family finally figures out that their house is a place where spirits pass through. This is another one that incorporates a lot of comedy into the ghost story. I like the story because it kind of reminded me of the movie Poltergeist, where the people's new home is a portal to the spirit world, albeit this time in a more comedic, lighthearted fashion. The third story, Waira, is a samurai story that takes place in feudal Japan. The story centers around 2 feudal lords who are in a conflict. The story begins with one of the lords and his men fleeing into the forest, being pursued by the lord's brother-in-law, who is trying to take control of the land. As this group goes deeper into the forest and the other lord's men pursue them, the body of some of the soldiers are found completely mutilated. As they go deeper into the forest, some of the soldiers start getting picked off by something and end up getting completely torn apart by it. At least for a while, it kind of comes off as a ghost story or horror story, while everything's unknown and it appears that the killings may be supernatural. Everything ends up getting revealed in the end, and it really isn't much of a horror story as much as it is a feudal era samurai story. And the last one is actually a really wholesome Christmas story called Joyful Bell. This one's not a horror story at all, though it does have a slight supernatural angle to it. So this is a nice collection of 4 short stories that are all really enjoyable reads and well written with really good art. And 7th on my list, I have Zashiki Onna by Minotaru Mochizuki. This manga is a short story about a young man who ends up being stalked by a strange, creepy woman. The main character is a college student who lives alone in an apartment, and he sees this extremely tall, creepy-looking woman pounding on his neighbor's door. He sees her when he comes out of his apartment and exchanges a few words with her. After this, she begins to direct her attention towards him. Throughout the story, her actions begin to escalate. First, just showing up unexpectedly, knocking on the door, progressing to calling unexpectedly even though he never gave the number out, and then eventually breaking into his apartment while he's not there. The woman's actions start to get more and more severe, and her behavior becomes more and more obsessive and unhinged, coming to the point where she's acting completely insane and proving to be a major threat to him. The creepy thing about this manga is that a lot of the things that happen are things that could potentially happen in real life. It's something that could happen to anyone, where if they just come in contact with someone crazy who becomes fixated on them and begins to stalk them. especially in the early chapters. A lot of the things a woman does are more plausible, which is creepy because it's things that could happen in real life to someone. And this plays into a lot of fears of things like having people watching you when you don't know it, having your privacy invaded, and having people invade into your safe space when you're most vulnerable, such as like when you're asleep. The woman in this manga is really creepy at times, and some of the faces and stuff that she's drawn with are really scary. The manga, especially towards the end, sort of has a little bit of a supernatural urban legend type feel to it. Towards the later parts of the manga, she feels more supernatural in a way. Nothing the main character can do helps him get away from her, and it seems like no matter what he does, she finds a way to find him, and she has almost supernatural abilities. Like, she runs really fast, and she could take a lot of damage and be pretty much unaffected. So in those parts of the story loses some of the realism, and the story goes more into an urban legend type of horror that reminds me more of stories like the Slit-Mouth Woman and some of those famous Japanese urban legends. For number 8 on my list, I'm going to go with Yokai Hunter by Daijiro Morohoshi. This is a fairly obscure manga series written by a manga artist that I hardly hear anyone ever talk about, who has some works that I think are really notable. The Yokai Hunter series is about a former archaeology professor who is shunned by the academic world after claiming that yokai exist. The stories in the series focus on a number of Japanese folk tales and old stories of yokai. Each story focuses on a type of yokai, where the professor, Hieda Reijiro, travels around and investigates folk tales and folklore in order to track down and prove the existence of yokai. Each story in the series focuses on a different folktale and a different type of yokai, and some of these stories are really well thought out. They make a lot of references to a lot of famous Japanese folktales. I think the stories are pretty interesting and focus on a different type of horror, more of a folklore, old ghost stories type of horror rather than explicitly horror. Sometimes there are some horror aspects where horrifying things happen, but it's mostly more of a folklore kind of manga. I think a lot of the stories are pretty well researched and pretty well told, especially the later ones. Some of the stories were kind of misses to me, especially some of the early ones in the series, but some of the later ones I thought were really good and were really interesting stories. One reason I really like this series is because it kind of reminds me of a supernatural version of one of my favorite manga, The Case Notes of Professor Munakata, which is a folklore manga that I really enjoy and think is really well thought out and really underrated. So I do recommend reading that if you get a chance. This is kind of like a supernatural yokai-based version of that in a way, and I enjoy this manga because of that. At number 9, I've got another anthology horror series, this one being Akai and its sequels, Kuroi and Shiroi. This is an anthology horror series with story by Masaya Hokazono and art by Matosuke Takaminato. This is a collection of a bunch of horror short stories that feature a wide number of different types of horror stories. Once again, this is a positive and negative because some of the stories are really strong and some of them not so much, but a benefit of this is the fact that different types of horror appeal to different types of people. Having a wide array of different types of horror stories gives it a higher chance of having something that everyone would enjoy in it. I think this is a really underrated horror anthology. The art style and the stories shown in this manga remind me of some of my favorite horror manga, which are the works of Masaki Nakayama, Fuen no Tane, and Koisho Radio, which are probably my favorite horror manga, and also the horror manga that I consider to be the scariest horror manga that I've read. While I don't think this collection is quite as strong as that, at times I think some of the stories do reach that level. Some of the stories are a little bit over the top and a little bit cartoonish at times, and I don't think are quite as good, but the stories that really work definitely work, and I think are some of the scariest horror manga stories that I've ever read. The art I think is really great and has some really terrifying scenes that look incredible. Some of the ghosts that it shows, the faces are really terrifying and actually remind me a lot of the faces from ghosts in Fuen no Tane or Koisho Radio, which is probably why I like this manga a lot. After I read all of Nakayama's works that are available and not having any more of his stuff to read, this is probably the next best thing for me. The first volume in the series is Akai, and I think it's the weakest of the bunch. It's still alright, but I think it gets better with the following two series. There were a few stories in there that I really loved and stuck with me for a really long time after. And I think this is a really underrated collection of horror stories. especially Kuroi and Shiroi Han. I almost never see these discussed by horror manga fans, and I can't vouch for every single story in the collection, but I do guarantee that there are some stories in there that are definitely worth reading and will definitely satisfy any horror manga fan. And last on my list, I'm going to go with one that's really obscure, and that is Gamurakan by Yoji Fukuyama. This manga is probably one of the most obscure horror manga that I've read. On my enemy list, it only has 106 users that have it on their list, which is a shame because this one is actually a really unique manga and a really underrated one. I was surprised to see how few people have read this manga, because it's actually at times a pretty creepy story with really unique artwork and really unique visuals. And the story is kind of a type of horror story that I've never seen anything really similar to it before, so it's very unique. And it is a very strange, very weird manga, probably one of the weirdest manga that I've read. So if you're looking for something more straightforward and not too weird, this probably isn't for you, but I do really appreciate how unique this manga is. The main character is a lawyer named Aoi Midorikawa, who is hired by a landlady for the eviction of a resident of the apartment complex that she owns. When he gets to the apartment is very strange. It's padlocked up and there's a strange liquid oozing from the door. Once he visits the apartment, he begins to see visions of these things he calls angels, which are anything but angelic. They're small, naked women with the face of a doll that start appearing out of nowhere all around him. They cause him these really strange, bizarre hallucinations. These visions of these angels begin to spread to other people around him, and end up spreading to people all around the city, causing widespread hallucination and madness. I'll leave the description of the plot there because I can't really do justice for the story and how weird it gets. But I definitely recommend this manga because it's so bizarre and so unlike any other horror manga that I've ever read. The art's got a really creepy style, especially the way that the angels are drawn and some of the hallucinations that people see. The art really isn't all that detailed or the best on a technical level, but it's got a pretty unique, creepy style that's got a really good atmosphere to it. So that's going to do it for my list of my top 10 horror manga. I hope you find some new horror manga from this list that you really enjoy, and hope you enjoyed the video. Please like the video and subscribe to my channel for more videos like this. Also leave down in the comments any of your favorite horror manga that I haven't talked about yet. And thanks so much for watching the video.